Ladies and gentlemen, good evening or good afternoon. On behalf of Queen's MCR, I would like to welcome you all to the second Angevin talk in our series. We have guests attending in many different time zones. Thank you all for joining us. We are honored and delighted to welcome Professor Michael Spence as our very special guest this evening. Mike, a very warm welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, Anna. It's great. Wonderful.
How did you first learn that you were going to be the recipient of a Nobel Prize? Can you describe the phone call and feeling in the moment to us?
Yes, I can. I missed the phone call. So I was in Hawaii. They knew my phone number at Stanford in California. So the way they do it is they phone you, and if they can't get a hold of you, then they post the results on the web in Sweden, mid-afternoon. So translated into California time, that's about 6:30 in the morning. And a friend of mine was up, I don't know why, I think he's a little crazy, monitoring the website, and it flashed up and all the recipients were listed, and he phoned me because he knew where I was. So I got a phone call at 3:30 in the morning in Hawaii, and I was stunned. I just, I was pretty sleepy, but I was stunned. So for a while, it just didn't sink in.
What an incredible moment.
Right.
So what is your most memorable moment of the actual award ceremony?
Well, so actually, a lot of people have watched this movie, A Beautiful Mind, and they think that you give a lecture at the award ceremony. Actually, at the award ceremony, you're not allowed to say anything because you might muck it up. But there were two memorable moments. The one that I remember best was the lecture, which is separate from the award ceremony. And you basically are required to, and you're supposed to take this seriously, to give a lecture to normally a very distinguished group of, colleagues and graduate students in your field in Sweden. But this was the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize. And so not everybody was still, there were 760 or so in the first 100 years. And ones who were still alive, they invited back, and they all came. And the Nobel Prize in Economics dated from 1968, so a significant number of them were there. And so I and my colleagues, Joe Stiglitz and George Agerlof, got up to give a lecture, and in the front row were the, leaders of our field, Arrow, Samuelson, Solow, Friedman, Becker. And I thought, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. But it was wonderful. I mean, they're lovely people, so it turned out to be great. The other thing I remember is the youngest person in our cohort that year was a physicist. And basically at the award ceremony, you only have to do one thing, which is stand up at the appropriate time, bow to your colleagues behind you and the audience before you, but especially to the king and queen and the princess and the monarchy. And then you walk over, and the king in Sweden is very adept at handing you a whole lot of stuff, like medals and so on. And you bow again and then go back to your seat. And this I won't name him, but the youngest guy was a physicist, and he basically tuned out right at the moment. And so he forgot to bow to anybody, kind of marched over looking vaguely like a parody of a soldier in a war movie, collected his loot and went back. There was a kind of gasp, but it turned out very well. The king, he went to the king afterwards. There's a reception, and he said, "I'm terribly sorry, I just blacked out." And the king of Sweden looked at him and said, "Oh, you did? I didn't notice."
Yeah. How special to have all of the notable people in a room at the same time.
No, it was extraordinary. Yeah. And not just in our field. I mean,
absolutely.
Physics, medicine, etc.
Yeah. You were awarded the Nobel for laying the foundations for the theory of markets with asymmetric information. an important example of your signaling theory is education as a signal of high individual productivity in the job market.
Mhm.
Can you briefly explain this to us?
I can try. So there's lots of markets in which there's informational gaps and asymmetries, where sellers or buyers know less or more than the other side of the market. In the job market, there's a big informational gap because people have very specific abilities and skills, and employers, at least until they've employed them for a while, don't know what they are. And so, in markets like that, you get underperformance if these informational gaps aren't closed, but markets don't just sit idly by. So there's what we call screening and signaling mechanisms. And basically the way they work is the underlying phenomenon is there's something that somebody wants to know on the other side of the market that they can't easily detect or see. And you can't close that gap by simply having people sort of describe, what their attributes, because the incentive structures don't work. In the market for lemons, which is the paper for which George Akerlof, the lemons are cars that are disasters. If somebody comes along and says, well, my car is not a lemon, you have no particular reason to believe it or not. So the question that I and others were asking is, well, are there signals that are credible in markets? And the answer is yes. And those signals have the characteristic that the cost of doing whatever it is that the signaling activity is lower for the people with the highly valuable attribute or quality in the product. And then it turns out there's lots of examples of that, and one of them is education. So people who tend to be, at least in some lines of work, very capable are ones that are able to navigate through and get into the Queen's College, Cambridge, I guess is the way I would say it.
So to your point then, with institutions such as Cambridge constantly striving to improve outreach and access to education, how do you think the signaling theory could be adapted to assist individuals from less advantageous backgrounds who are less able to signal to employers so they don't become disadvantaged in the job market?
Yeah, so I don't think you can change the whole system, but what you can do is make sure that people from all backgrounds, or you can try to make sure that people from all backgrounds can get into Cambridge or Queen's College or MIT or Stanford, right? And there are known biases in the screens that are used to do that. And there's a significant effort over actually many decades to eliminate those biases in the screening procedure. Some of it's testing, some of it's sort of social networks that operate in the world that we live in. And you can't eliminate them, but at least you can try to compensate for them. So it's a very important part of the work that the admission side of major, global institutions have to undertake.
Yes. Well, so a large part of human behavior is signaling. In the clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the drinks we order in a bar. So how can signaling theory be applicable to us in our everyday lives?
Well, in the course of doing this work over, several years, I read a fair amount of sociology and, things that weren't strictly in the world of economics, because these signaling, and trying to figure out who you're dealing with isn't specific to economics at all. In fact, probably it's more relevant in these other disciplines. So what I found fascinating is that people emit signals all the time, and a very large fraction of that time they don't know that they're emitting signals. And then they're experts at interpreting these signals. And there are even courses on helping other people who don't know how to interpret them figure out, what they're signaling inadvertently that they might not want to signal. So there's a whole field in sociology and psychology and marketing, for that matter, and organizational behavior and leadership courses. It's all over the place, that because people do. Emit telltale signs, right? Whether they're lying or they respect the person they're talking to or whatever it is. Anyway, I find that fascinating. The other thing I found fascinating was Veblen. So Veblen was a brilliant but fairly complicated character. And one of the things he realized fairly early on is that the way people who are wealthy signal, that they're wealthy is they buy things other people can't afford. And some things are offered on the marketplace at very high prices, not because, and in limited supply, this is crucial, not because they're inherently have that value, but because they provide a signal.
Like a Rolls Royce, for example.
Like a Rolls Royce, yeah. Or a diamond that's so big it, practically weighs your hand down or something like that.
So your book, The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World, is about growth, development, and convergence of the global economy. So what do you believe the impact of the pandemic has been on developing countries? And can they bounce back?
Well, the impact has been quite large and negative for a lot of reasons. But I think it's fairly easy to see. Right now, they're having trouble getting the vaccines, right? So their recovery, to the extent it's required, containing the virus is required, and it is going to be delayed relative to some of the rest of us. And that, that's not good. And it certainly exacerbates, a pattern of inequality that automatically goes with the fact that not everybody lives in a developed country. But in addition to that, if you look at, the major developed countries, most of them, I think all of them, have mounted fairly substantial fiscal programs to buffer the shock, to prevent people from, not being able to eat, not being able to hang on to their homes and so on. And these are huge programs. They vary from one place to the next, but it's not, and many of these, to use the word economists would use, many poorer countries don't have enough fiscal space to mount such a program. So they're the only way you can keep an economy functioning if you don't have the resources to introduce these buffers is just keep running the economy. And that makes the virus worse, right? Then it just runs rampant through the economy. So on all counts, it's a very tough thing to deal with. And now I think the hope on the part of a number of us is that once the developed countries have largely completed the vaccination programs, they'll turn at least some of their attention to trying to help mitigate, the end of the pandemic process in the developing countries.
Yes. And there's a lot of antivirals that are being developed as well that are cheaper than vaccine, quicker. There's a lot of things happening on that front, and hopefully we'll see things on that very quickly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yesterday, you published an article titled "The Shape of the Global Economy." Mm-hmm. I know it's time for our talk. In your opinion, how impaired will global growth be? And what can we expect for the balance of the year and into 2022?
So actually, I'm quite optimistic about this. Nobody knows, right? We haven't taken this journey before. So we're all guessing a little bit. And I don't pretend my crystal ball is any better or worse than anybody else's. But it looks to me like in most of the countries, in most of the developed countries anyway, and a very large number of the emerging economies that are, in the middle income level, so they have resources, are going to come out of the pandemic economy and all its constraints relatively soon, let's say the fall. And then I think we're going to see a fairly explosive kind of growth as the sectors that essentially got shut down or significantly shut down in the course of dealing with the pandemic open up again. So on the supply side, you're going to open these things up. On the demand side, while people may save and rebuild their balance sheets to some extent. I mean, I think most people think there's also a fair amount of pent-up demand, or to put it in technical terms, people are fed up with being locked up in their house. So on all counts, I think once you take the constraints off, you're going to see a pattern of really quite strikingly rapid growth and recovery. Now, the contraction was huge, right? So just high growth isn't fully recovered, right? It may take us a while. Probably in America, it'll take us into the early part of 2022 to be back where we started at the end of 2019. In Europe, it's going to take longer because the vaccines, except for UK being a distinct outlier, vaccines are arriving more slowly. But if you sort of average out over that, by the time you get to the end of 2021, current year, and into 2022, you're going to start seeing pretty dramatic recovery patterns. And in Asia, they recovered without, they contained the virus without the benefit of vaccines. Now they're vaccinating, but they recovered more quickly. The only major economy in the world that had positive real growth in 2020 is China.
Yes, and I want to get to China in a few moments, because I know there's a lot of interest on your views there. I mean, what do you think? Chair Powell said yesterday he's expecting the US growth to be in the region of 6.5%.
Yeah, that's the rebound. I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable estimate. On a sustained basis, no developed economy can grow at 6%. An emerging economy, an India or a China can grow at 6% because, they're catching up, basically, is the kind of underlying, a crude description of the underlying theory. But when we're recovering and bouncing back, we can see very high growth rates like those that Chairman Powell described.
So do you feel economies have fared better in this crisis than in the last financial crisis?
It depends on what dimension you're looking at, Anna. I mean, I think that the financial crisis in some ways was more difficult to handle because there was a question about whether the financial system would keep functioning. And so the response had to be, in part, at least directed at making sure the financial system didn't lock up, didn't stop functioning, because that would bring the economy down. And that turned out to be, I think, too limited an agenda, and not enough attention was devoted to helping, other people that had been hurt. But because we didn't have that second part, for whatever reason, in most places, and the reasons differ. I mean, we had too much austerity in Europe. We had kind of gridlock in America. And so on. So we just didn't get around to it. But the thing that really hurt us was that we bailed out financial institutions that were part of the cause of the problem. And that turned out to be just enormously unpopular for good reason. And it's left continuing, fault lines and scars in our society as a result. So in a sense, I mean, the economic shock wasn't as big in the great financial crisis as this one at its low point, if I can put it that way. But I think this one was in some ways easier to handle and certainly better handled.
Yeah, so in your recent article earlier this month for Project Syndicate, you talked about the winners and losers in the digital transformation of work. You concluded by saying digital transformation of work will leave many people behind with adverse long-run consequences for social cohesion. Can we discuss this and why it is very important for policymakers to focus on measures to reduce income and wealth inequality?
Yeah, so we're in, I don't think it's any secret, we're in a major, transformation, the digital transformation. It has many, many dimensions and lots of upside potential, but it is going to change work. I mean, my simple way to describe it is in the first industrial revolution, we harnessed energy and got machines in the physical world. But there's another part of the world that's very important that kind of controls things. I call it the information coordination and decision-making layer of the economy. And that is where the machines are arriving. But that's a post-war phenomenon. You know, after the first industrial revolution, we had machines, cars, you know, industrial machines, spinning machine, weaving machines, all kinds of things, tractors, but humans remained the only agents in the information control decision-making layer, and that is what's changing. And because that's changing, and now fairly rapidly, it means these machines are going to be our working partners, and tasks are going to change. And that means, you know, a transition. And it probably means, you know, fairly major shifts in the skills that people will require. You know, not the scientists who are going to, you know, follow their science, but, you know, a lot of lines of work. And I don't think that transition is impossible. The public sector has a role. The education sector has, you know, broadly defined as a significant role. But people have a role. You know, they invest in themselves in order to make these transitions. And if you start with very high income and wealth inequality, then at the lower end of the spectrum, and by lower end, I mean lower half, you know, there's a real question about whether people have the resources to make those investments. And so that's how income and wealth inequality, which is a multi-decade trend of varying magnitude depending on where you are, gets tangled up, you know, with this. If we were in better shape with respect to the distribution of resources that families, households, and so on could deploy to navigate these transitions that we're all going to have to go through anyway, then I think it would, you know, it wouldn't be painless. It's kind of disruptive. It's harder for old people, and so on. But it wouldn't be as worrying as what we're seeing now. And so I think what I was trying to convey is that, you know, if we want to do this well, we have to directly address the income and wealth inequality. It's also multidimensional. I mean, properly measured, it's not just your income and what you have at the stockbroker and the bank. It's, you know, what services that are crucial, like education and health, are available at very high quality and low cost, et cetera. I mean, you know, all of those things matter.
And the availability of opportunity, obviously, to try and.
Right.
So just under a year ago, you wrote an article with Mohammed Al-Arian called The Great Unequalizer: Why the Pandemic is Compounding Disparities in Income, Wealth, and Opportunity. So what measures, in your opinion, now need to be taken in an effort to rectify what has occurred by what you have both described as a generation-defining crisis?
Yeah, well, it certainly was that. I think what we had in mind is that, you know, some of what we need to do is being done, right? So the observation that really gets your attention, and I'll do it with an example, is that the pandemic hit, on average, people in the lower part of the income distribution much harder. So in the American economy, hospitality, which is restaurants, hotels, etc., is an industry that was largely shut down, has among the lowest, you know, wages and income levels in the economy, and employs 17 million people, you know, outside the pandemic structure. So you shut down a huge set of sectors in the economy which employ people, you know, fairly near the bottom end of the sort of income spectrum, and they're hurt. And, you know, that pattern, I mean, you could document it in lots of different ways, but the correlation between income level and ability to keep working and being paid online is quite high. So anyway, it's a big adverse shock, domestically and globally, for the reasons we talked about. And I think the good thing that's happened is the governments have stepped in and recognized that. And I mean, it sort of sounds nerdy, but basically, a shock of this magnitude, you lose your employment, but you don't, if you had a buffer in terms of previous savings, you're going to use it up. So in the end, it produces balance sheet damage. And what the governments have done is transfer that balance sheet damage to the public sector by issuing debt. And I think that, I mean, nobody wants to see public debt go through the roof, but if the alternative is leaving people stranded, then I think they did the right thing. And so that's part of it. I think the rest of it is, you know, leadership, behave well, and get the economy back running as fast as we can in all dimensions. Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of time, but because there's a lot of Q&A, but your quick, deep, you know, your quickest version of what's going on in China right now, and how do they currently sit in with respect to the rest of the world?
Well, they're not very well liked in a large part of the world. I mean, Europe has, there are surveys, there are negative attitudes. They're probably not quite as extreme as the negative attitude that you find in the United States, but there's no question the tensions are high and rising. The pandemic has not taken that away. In some ways, it's made it worse. And, you know, there are opportunists in every field, including politics, that find it convenient, right, to blame it on outsiders or something like that, and don't think very carefully that maybe it will, you know, rebound in a highly negative way with respect to one's own fellow citizens. And we just saw an example of that in the United States. No, but China basically is it's a market economy, but with a big government that has lots of assets and is quite directive. So it's a dynamic economy. It's about 80% the size of Europe or America now. It's in some fields at or, you know, on a par in the frontier, like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. So it's not the early stage developing country that it was 30 or 40 years ago when they started doing the reforms.
Right. They are actually providing a very clear statement for internal consumption and self-sufficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, exactly. They have this thing, they have wonderful names. So now they call the strategy of the 14th five-year plan the dual circulation economy. That Westerners might get it confused with the circular economy, which is a very different thing. That's all, you know, also important. But what they mean is they have an externally oriented part of the economy, which used to be dominant in terms of growth because the domestic economy wasn't very big, right? And now they're sort of tipping the balance and becoming more self-reliant on both the supply side, you know, like semiconductors and making things we need so nobody can cut us off, and on the demand side, where, you know, we're going to rely more on domestic demand to enable our economy to grow and develop and thrive. So that's where they're going. I think on balance so far, if you stick to sort of performance measures that are mainly economic, the performance has been very good and quite stunning over certain periods of time. The quibbles people have with China, at least Westerners, tend to have to do with their dislike of the governance model. It is a single party system, and it's in control, right? So we're all I'll give you a quick example. We're all wrestling with the question of whether if some internet content is so damaging, we need to screen it out, right? But in the West, we don't have a very good answer as to the question, well, like say, whose job is that, right? Who has the authority, you know, and legitimacy to get that job done? That's a very hard question to answer in a constitutionally structured democracy. In China, it's not a hard question to answer at all. I mean, the answer is clear, and they're doing it, the party. So they value stability. They don't like potentially destabilizing things socially. So it's a very different world. And I think if you stand back from it, if we're going to interact constructively with each other, we're going to have to find a way to do it that doesn't assume we're all kind of the same in terms of governance and values and so on.
Yeah, and it's an environment of compliance, so it's very different to what we're used to.
Right.
Do you believe there must be a compromise between economic growth and working to prevent climate change? Or do you think it's possible to achieve both simultaneously? Just quickly.
Very quickly, yes. I think it is possible. I think it is possible, but this is a journey we haven't ever taken before. So we actually don't know. So I can imagine that there's a fair amount of disagreement on that. My best guess is the trade-off is not very difficult, and that that sustainable growth models don't, except maybe in some transitions, don't require major sacrifices in material well-being, if I can put it that way. Now, there are people who disagree with that, and there are people who are absolutely sure it's true, and we're about to find out. I mean, the other thing I would say is we've left it pretty late. We're really, really behind the curve. I mean, our fossil fuel emissions are running in the neighborhood of 30+ billion gigatons per year. That's not even within shooting distance of something that's reasonably safe with respect to sustainability, not even close. And that number is still rising in spite of all the talk. So we have a major challenge ahead of us, and because it's kind of urgent to get it done, I think there may be some sacrifice that's needed in terms of, you know, other dimensions of economic well-being in order to accomplish this on a time scale that prevents or reduces the risk of catastrophic results.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a trade-off, and I think we are all going to have to think very carefully about that. So the final question from me, if you could give your PhD level self one bit of advice, what would it be?
I would say study as many different things as you can. Just get outside your field. I mean, there's great, when you're a PhD student, you know, you're naturally digging about as deep as you can get in a particular field or even a subfield, and that's fine. But my advice is allocate some time to straying outside of that. And I think I would give that advice, you know, not just to people at the PhD level, but later on. I really think even people who've done amazing things in various fields benefit enormously every, you know, maybe 10 or 15 years of just changing and doing something else, because I think you go kind of stale. The other piece of advice is I would say take risks. I mean, but PhD students are, young people in general, are at the height of their creativity. They may not know as much as some of the sort of older folk, but they're not trapped by the conventional wisdom of their field in a way that almost everybody else almost inevitably is. So you know, when I was a PhD student, my advisors, I was doing something that probably looked pretty risky at the time, and they didn't try to stop me. And I've always been grateful for them. They just kind of said, go for it. And if it doesn't work, you can do something else. I mean, so that would be, that's my best.
Right, and that's how we all develop, and that's where innovation comes from. Mike,
Absolutely.
Thank you very, very much. I'm so sorry to have rushed through this. What a fascinating conversation, and thank you for all your pearls of wisdom. I will hand it over now to Emily for the Q&A. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Anna. Fun being with you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you both for a wonderful talk. It was fascinating and great pieces of advice to end on. I'm sure they resonate with lots of people here. So we've had questions flooding in. So we're going to start with Nicholas from the MCR. So Nicholas, if you'd like to appear and ask your question, then please go ahead.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, and also thank you, Professor Spence, for being here. It's an honor. My question concerns high frequency trading, because I've read that one of your beliefs is that it should be banned, and I was just wondering why exactly you believe that. If you could elaborate a bit, maybe what your thoughts on it are from a cost-benefit perspective.
Yeah, I was probably a little out over my skis on that one. So let me tell you what worries me. We have a lot of algorithmic trading going on. and I don't think we completely understand, how it kind of, in the aggregate sense, affects market behavior. And we've had some, because these are black boxes, a lot of them. You know that AI is a black box kind of operation, but what I guess the test I use, Nicholas, is I ask myself the question: is this really kind of socially productive, right? And then I remind myself that the high-speed traders, at the height of the mania of this, were building their own fiber optic cables from Chicago to New Jersey, where the servers were, from the commodities exchange to the servers in New Jersey, so that they would get trades a millionth of a second before somebody else and there was documentary evidence, and front run the market, right? And so I think, and then I ask myself, is that really terribly useful? And the answer, at least my answer, is no. So I don't mean to ban, all trading of that type, but I think we ought to be skeptical about its value. But the defense is, there is a fair amount of value created by the online, version of markets, because the transaction costs go down. So I'm not quibbling with that. And I don't even mind, machines getting into the business if they're augmenting human beings. But I worry about markets as important as some of our financial markets if they're basically a bunch of algorithms competing with each other in millionths of a second.
Thank you. So we had a question from Professor Lisa Hall on the chat. So she was just wondering, what kind of signals outside of economics do you now notice that you may have missed before you developed your theory?
Well, Tom Schelling, who was one of my advisors, actually had me reading a whole bunch of stuff, much of which wasn't economics. And I remember, reading Irving Goffman and some other books that I just found fascinating. So for example, in lots of cultures, there's a question, for couples who might get married, about how you signal the seriousness of your interest, because it's easy to say. Right? And so there was this example, which I loved, which is that I can't remember exactly where it is, but in some places that the young man, the suitor, goes and plants himself outside the house of the woman he is trying to tell he has fallen in love with, and basically stays there. And the notion is that somebody who wasn't really serious about this probably would give up. So if the suitor manages to stay outside the house and not go home and have a shower for 10 days, the young woman may not still may not like him, but at least he's paid a price that's high enough to allow him to proceed with the process. But yeah, I think there's lots of areas. Some of them are in economics, some are in finance. There was an early discussion of whether and why dividends are signals in anything. And I think the tentative conclusion is they are, because you pay an awful price if you reduce your dividend. So if you set it at a level you believe you can sustain with a high probability, then you're probably signaling that you actually think the earnings are going to be able to back them up.
Fascinating, thank you. It's amazing how there's such a wide range of applications. We've also had a question from someone, Vandenek, who's watching on YouTube. So their question is, in your opinion, where do you think business schools most severely misunderstand economics research and economic theory?
Gosh, I would have said, so when I became a dean at Stanford, the business school, the criticism of business schools is that they spend too much time on economics and not enough on business. And that was basically the gist of the U.S. News and World Reports that went after the elite business schools. And there was some justification for that. We had turned into sort of mini social science, faculties, and maybe weren't paying enough attention to business. And I think there's been a kind of rebalancing. But I wouldn't have characterized businesses as, at all second rate in the kind of economics that they do in terms of their research and teaching. In fact, I think frequently the economics is enriched in business schools by being informed by other subjects. But, economics has become quite rich in the last little while. We have behavioral and experimental economics. These are very close to fields like behavioral and organizational behavior and so on. The marketing people, I think, give a completely different sort of sense. Now we have all the digital folks, doing research and informing the agenda. So, as compared with way back when, I think we're in pretty healthy shape. At least that's my sense in the business school, in a kind of rich research and teaching agenda.
Yeah, lovely to hear optimistic comments. And I think that the kind of intertwined nature is something that we all really gain from Queen's as well. Having lots of different perspectives to the same topic can be so valuable, for sure. So we've had a lovely comment from Rubaya in the chat. So she says she's absolutely thrilled to hear you speak. She's drawing from your signaling theory in their PhD research, which looks at the linkage between education and employment in Bangladesh.
Interesting.
Yeah. So their question is, what's led you to conceptualize the signaling theory? And they're wondering if there's any special story like Newton's apple story. And then second part to their question is, what advice would you have for someone who's just starting out their academic career, and how to translate academic research into significant impact? So yeah, two parts to the question.
Yeah, so on the first part, I was when I was a young academic, and I went to college in the United States, and I was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and then I was a PhD student. And about the end of the second year of the PhD, which all of you are familiar with, was fed up. So I went to Richard Zeckhauser, who was turned out to, in the end, to be one of my thesis advisors, and said, "I'm going to quit. I'm tired of talking to myself and sitting in the library." And he said, "Well, maybe you should try teaching." And so I did. It was a disaster, but at least I was in contact with other human beings. And he said, "Why don't you be the faculty rapporteur in the new seminar that the Kennedy School had?" The Kennedy School at that time was exactly 1 year old at Harvard. It was a creation of President Derek Bok, and it had amazing people around it, Schelling, Don Price, Kenneth Arrow. Anyway, these people got together once a week. And my job was to take an unstructured discussion and write up 12 pages that made it sound like it was, all brilliant and followed logically and everything. And to this day, Kenneth Arrow thinks that my main skill in life was being a rapporteur, as opposed to doing research or anything like that. I used to laugh with him about it. Anyway, Les Thoreau came down from MIT. All of these, we've lost all these people in the last few years. It's a shame. But Les Thoreau came down and gave a talk because there was a lot of concern about discrimination in economics. How did it work? What was the economic underpinnings? Was it all just bias? But, it was kind of a systems. And he came down and gave a talk about statistical discrimination, which is not a subject you hear much about, but is actually pretty interesting. And the notion is, and it really relates to informational gaps, right? So if you have a very important attribute that's distributed in a population and invisible, then this is the Lemons model, then that group will be treated like the average. And that means the people on the upper end will be discriminated against, by that standard, and the lower end will benefit. And so he went on about this, and I was just fascinated. And then I walked away and I thought, this is part of the informational structure of markets for sure, but it can't be the whole story. There must be something in markets that occurs to try to close these gaps, even if it's not perfect. And that's what led me and others. I did it in terms of signaling. Others went at it from the point, it's the flip side of that is screening, right? If you have people coming at you who you can't distinguish, and look at it from that point of view, you want to screen, or sort, or some version of that. I just did it the other way around. What do people do that signal characteristics, attributes, or whatever it is they want? So that was the origin of that. What was the second part?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And then the second part was just about any advice you may have for us who are starting out, how to translate academic research into significant impact, long lasting.
So one of the things I've noticed in academia there's two things I've noticed that are really different, at least in my field, and that is most academic papers in economics, maybe even in social science, have 4 or 5 authors, or at least 3, and I think that's not a bad thing. But then I think you have to think carefully about because in my day, most papers had a single author, right? So it was kind of clear whose work it was, good or bad, right? So I think there's a question I've always had in my mind, about what's the process whereby your distinctive contribution kind of shows up. And the other thing I've observed is that there are some academics who have enormously great influence beyond their field. And they have what I can only describe as big marketing apparatuses as well, which was just unheard of in my day. I mean, nobody, had a communications department that dealt with media and all this kind of thing. But my advice is sort of, at least in the early stages of one's career, stick to the research. Great research will surface first among the people in the field, and then more broadly. And I wouldn't worry about it more broadly. I mean, it'll happen eventually, but you can't rush it. I don't know how many years ago did Crick and Watson discover the structure of DNA? No, probably by now 45 or 50, something like that. So these are very, very powerful ideas, but it takes a very long time for them to start to have an impact.
Yeah. In it for the long run, I guess.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Rob Glue in the chat. Rob is wondering that given that household wealth in the UK, for example, is around 6 to 7 times GDP, do you think that a wealth tax might reduce wealth inequality, and what might the unintended consequences be?
A wealth tax might, reduce inequality, but I'm not inclined to kind of rush into a wealth tax. In part because, and this may answer, a kind of related question. First of all, wealth taxes are resented, right? With a few exceptions. So in the American case, we all think wealth taxes are, meaning broadly, people think wealth taxes are a bad idea. And they've forgotten that they pay, quite substantial property taxes to support the school system. And a property tax is a wealth tax, right? So we kind of have schizophrenia when it comes to wealth tax, but it's a very difficult thing. I mean, when the left-leaning Democratic candidates even started talking about it in the last presidential campaign, it wasn't well received, at least not by everybody. But the most important thing, I think, is that you don't really deal with the underlying problem, either with a massive redistributive approach to income or wealth, right? And the reason is it doesn't solve the underlying problems that people care about, like that Anna mentioned, opportunity, being educated enough to, sort of access those opportunities, getting the kind of support you need when you go through that process. So I'm not against progressive tax systems or even a universal basic income of some form or other, provided it doesn't have very negative incentive effects, and allows a lot of free riding and stuff. But I think I'd rather focus on a set of measures that are more attractive from a redistributional point of view, and measures that, maybe I'm overreacting just to the American case, but our quality problems in education, quality unevenness, is so large that I'd rather, if I could wave a magic wand and solve a problem, I would solve that one first. I think I guess what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to what you were talking about with Anna earlier about trying to not disadvantage people due to
Exactly.
So we next have a question from Jason, and I think Jason's happy to ask the question themselves if you would like to appear to ask your own question.
Yes, that's really an honor for me. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Dr. Spence, for sharing with us, because as a graduate student, we have just learned your signal model a month ago in the lecture. So it's very great to hear right from you afterwards. So I would like to ask a question, because this is what I was thinking during the lecture, because you developed this model with individuals with their education effort and stuff. Do you think that this Spence model can be applied to more than just individuals, such as maybe like service quality as a signal to company health, or like when technology progresses as a signal to the economic strength, etc. If we apply this, do you think there will be any limitations? Thank you very much.
The answer to that is definitely yes. So, I mean, one of the I'm going to talk just for a second later in a minute about the digital era, but even before that, lots of markets have market structure that consists of intermediaries. One of the ways you solve the problem of credible communication is you put an entity in the middle of the market whose reputation matters, right? And so they don't lie. I mean, to put it in its crudest terms, because they don't have an incentive to lie, because then they'll lose their status as an intermediary. And so that's been well studied. That's, game theory in a sense. And that's those things are important. So the answer is, I mean, there's lots of it. You have these signaling mechanisms, but there's lots of things that go on in markets that are designed to deal with informational gaps, including, by the way, regulation, right? In the financial world, we don't rely on companies, voluntarily to tell you as much as they think as you ought to know as an investor about what they're doing. I mean, there's very clear requirements about what they're supposed to disclose, and there are very clear penalties if they, don't do it properly. So sometimes informational gaps have to be closed by regulation. Sometimes they have to be closed by a government entity. Almost everybody has some version of the Food and Drug Association, because somebody who's a third party, who's independent, has to investigate and discover, whether there are hidden dangerous characteristics of food and drugs and products as well. So anyway, I'm just trying to explain that signaling and screening was kind of an entry point into thinking about informational structure of markets, but there's a lot more to it. The thing that fascinates me, although this would take us another hour, is that the digital technologies, and specifically these huge pools of data combined with machine learning, are actually closing informational gaps in markets. I mean, you can see it. I mean, the credit markets are a perfect example of this. And Chinese and other, major players, but I think the Chinese are in the lead on this, have found that if they pool enough data, from their mobile payments, fintech, and e-commerce systems, they can extend credit to people who basically are anonymous otherwise, right? No collateral, bank can't deal with them. When they do borrow, they borrow at exorbitant rates and so on. So there's quite a lot of what I and other people call inclusive growth patterns that can be unlocked with this kind of technology. So, I mean, for people who are interested in this general area, one piece of advice would be get up to speed on how the digital technologies are working and evolving, because I think it's first order impact on the way markets are put together.
Thank you very much.
So thank you. I think we just have time for one final question from Mohammed. If you would like to unmute and appear, you're welcome to ask your question to finish us all.
Emily, I was hoping you would ask it for me. But thank you. And Mike, thank you very much for spending time with us. I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, but one thing that struck me, Mike, is the fact that you are so smart, and yet when you meet someone, you assume they are smarter than you. So even when they say something that's ridiculous, you will spend time trying to understand what they've said. How did you develop that skill? How do you stop falling into the trap of simply dismissing people based on saying something that may not resonate with you immediately?
Well, Mohammed, first of all, there are a lot of people that are smarter than I am, and I met a lot of them. So it was a fairly easy conclusion to reach. I always thought, my great strength was more like along the lines of stubbornness. I mean, I look at my thesis advisors, for example. Dick Seckhauser is one of the smartest people I know, and the other two received Nobel Prizes, and I thought, I don't really belong in this company. But the real answer to your question is, I think you learn this when you're teaching. So I was a terrible teacher at the start. The first class Dick Seckhauser let me teach, it was it took 50 minutes long at Harvard, and I prepared 35 pages of single-space notes. And I thought my job was to cover that. And I got through the first 3 pages with 10 minutes to go, and then I accelerated. And I produced what I came to see afterwards as the educational equivalent of whiplash. And then Dick and I had a funny conversation afterwards, and he said, we probably tried to cover a little too much. But that's all preamble to say, I think when I became a better teacher is when I started listening. And even now, when I teach, I want the interaction to start almost immediately. And I say it right at the start. So I don't want you to wait for the question period. I want, if you've got something on your mind, it doesn't have to be a question. It could be a comment, or I don't understand this, or something. And then we'll start talking. And when you start doing that and listening to the question, when you start listening to it, then frequently you run into the following problem. The question may not be, if somebody's confused about something, the question may not be completely well formed. So you have to guess at what it is, and you may guess wrong, and then restate it in order to sort of get on with dealing with it. And after you restate it, it's a good practice to ask, is that kind of what you had in mind? And then you can answer the question. And that has 2 effects. I think it just makes the educational process much, much more effective. But it also incentivizes interaction, right? If you said, okay, I can't understand that question, next, you wouldn't have. So I learned this the hard way, just by practicing and doing. And in the course of it, I developed a theory about what was going on in a classroom. And one theory is somebody who knows a lot is transmitting it to some other people. And I came to believe that was false. That what's going on in a classroom is more like vaccinations or inoculation. That is, you provoke something and then a process occurs, mostly inside the individual, called the student, and the end product of that is learning. And it completely changes once you start to think of it that way, as a kind of catalyst, as opposed to transmitting knowledge here. It changes the way you go about teaching.
Yeah. Emily, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you all.
Thank you very much for facilitating the Q&A.
Thank you, Emily.
I know we had a lot of questions and I know there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to. So my apologies to everybody. Mike, thank you. This was the most fascinating hour. We can't thank you enough for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you to Queens in person when things open up. We would love to host you. I know there will be a lot of people that still want to talk to you. There, you have a fascination with economics, with technology and artificial intelligence, and we would love to hear a lot more from you on that and other topics. So we're indebted to you. Thank you.
Can't wait to do it. Yeah. Thank you so much. Great to see you, Anna.
Thank you. You too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.